Hi there. I have a few favorite Christian apologists, and among them is David Wood. And David Wood's a really great apologist who's going to be debating Matt Dillahunty coming up soon. And it just reminds me of a particular video that David made not too long ago. So I'm going to go ahead and play the beginning of this video so you can see what we're going to talk about today, which is the case of the silly skeptic. So here we go.
The first few seasons of Scooby-Doo followed a predictable pattern. In each episode, a ghost or a vampire or a monster would be terrorizing a mansion or a town or a carnival, and it would seem like there's something supernatural at work. But a few Scooby snacks and a corny song later, the mask would come off and the gang would find out that there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for what once seemed mysterious. Richard Dawkins! After seeing this pattern repeated over and over again, those of us who grew up watching Scooby-Doo concluded that there's a natural explanation for everything. Then one day, the gang goes to Moonscar Island, aka Zombie Island. The odd thing about Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island is that the ghosts and zombies turn out to be real. But Fred, after so many years of unmasking fake monsters, is too skeptical to accept that he's finally dealing with real monsters. At first, Fred's doubts are entirely warranted. When Lena tells him about the ghost pirate who haunts the island, Fred says,
"Well, no offense, Lena, but it's probably just some guy in an old pirate suit trying to scare off the local kids."
In a very similar way to Greg, in the Scooby-Doo, we have an example of Matt Dillahunty doing something quite similar with Tyler Vela. And this was reviewed recently by Braxton Hunter on Trinity Radio. So I'm going to play part of Braxton Hunter's review of this, which is very interesting because we can see some parallels between this and Scooby-Doo. Let's go.
There's supposedly a God that works in a supernatural way that isn't testable or verifiable by science. That's not a fault of the scientific method. That doesn't mean that method, that epistemology is in any way flawed. What it means is that if what?
I'm not blaming, I'm not saying that's a fault of the scientific method.
It's the fault of the God.
No.
Yes, it is. If there is in fact a God, if there is in fact a God who sets up a universe where scientific methodology is the single most consistently reliable way to understand truth, and an absence of perfect knowledge and understanding means that we cannot, nobody's demonstrated any mechanism by which we can investigate the supernatural. They haven't shown that the supernatural exists. They haven't shown that the supernatural can interfere with the natural world. They can't even show that a God answers intercessory prayer or anything like that.
So what would constitute good evidence according to Matt Dillahunty? Would something in the sky constitute good evidence according to Mr. Dillahunty? Let's find out what Braxton has to say. So let's see what is enough for Matt. And Tyler Vela here offered an explanation.
Roger Penrose calculated that the chances of the cosmos, the galaxy, reorganizing 100% of its particles is about 1 × 10⁸ power, right? That's the chances that the galaxy will just randomly and spontaneous reorganize all the particles, which is somewhat terrifying, even though that's, really beyond mathematical possibility. If suddenly some of the stars rearranged and said, "Matt, I'm Yahweh, I'm here," would something like that, right? If you're asking for evidence, empirical evidence, would something like that count as evidence for the existence of God?
Yes.
Why? What is the feature about that? If you can say, well, I have no direct evidence for another God, but I have evidence that my mind is a pattern forming machine. I have evidence that this is mathematically possible in a quantum world. Why would you go, God did it, rather than any natural claim, or I don't know, but that's just a brute fact. That's just the way reality is.
So I don't know if you caught it, but when you asked, would that be evidence for God? I said yes, but that evidence for God is not confirmation of God. So would that actually count as evidence toward the proposition that there's God? Sure.
Would that meet your standard?
Is that sufficient on its own to convince me that there is a Yahweh God? No. And because there's a number of really good reasons for this, not the least of which is, how do I rule out other possibilities? But because this proposition is absurd.
Now, understand what we're saying here. He is saying, it's like we've got Tyler Mouse and Matt Mouse. Does the human exist? Imagine in the analogy that these talking mice can also read English. And suddenly they come out of their hole one day, and on the wall it says, hey, Tyler Mouse and Matt Mouse, I actually exist. The Matt Mouse would have to say, okay, that counts for something. Okay, we're not throwing that out. That counts for something. But it doesn't convince me that there is something bigger than us, some being larger than us that could do that. Because how did you rule out other possibilities? Now, when you think about it, that is just, I mean, it's like what he said in the past. In his 2015 discussion with Matt Slick, he said that if someone parted an ocean in Jesus' name, it wouldn't be enough to convince him that something supernatural had happened. In the case of his debate with Mike Licona, it was asked, if an asteroid collided with the moon and suddenly in multiple languages it says God exists, would you believe that at least something supernatural would happen? Or when Mike further said, what if my head was severed and some period later, before you left the building, my head reattached and I began to talk to you about a conversation I had with one of your dead friends or relatives, expounding to you about a conversation you had with them before they died that only you and that person knew about. Would you then believe something supernatural had happened? And in all cases, the answer was no, and the reason the answer was no is because, I imagine, it's not repeatable or we didn't rule out something else. I think Matt's specific thing was we'd have to say, I guess that people's heads can reattach or something like that. If that's your level, and I've said it so many times, I'm going to say it again. You can, and I'm not saying this specifically about Matt, I'm saying this about atheists I've encountered in general, but if you want to mock Christianity and you want to make up these memes about Christianity and you want to talk about your sky daddy and look at the trees and all these kind of things that you want to say to make it sound like a fairy tale or make it sound like Santa Claus or something like that, just understand that what sounds far more absurd is the suggestion that those kinds of things could happen, and you still wouldn't believe something supernatural would happen or that God exists.
So what kind of evidence do we have for God existing? Well, if we can show that Jesus resurrected, we have solid evidence for God existing. And let's see what David Wood has to say.
Well, good evening. I'd like to thank Reston Bible Church for hosting our debate tonight. The resurrection of Jesus offers answers to more of the big questions than any other event in history. Does God exist? If so, does he care about us? Is there life after death? Do miracles occur? How can we know the true religion? Questions like that. And we had our answers to these questions when a group of women showed up at the tomb of Jesus and were greeted by an angel who said, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he has risen, just as he said." The early Christians defended this proclamation against critics, and it's an honor to carry on that defense nearly 2,000 years later. I'd also like to thank my friend John for representing the atheist position. This is my third debate with John, and his dedication continues to amaze me. I don't think Christians appreciate the sacrifice many of our atheist friends make when they spend so much of their time talking about Christianity. Anyone can understand why Christians want to discuss these issues. We believe they have eternal significance. But for atheists who are convinced that their existence ends in just a few decades, to spend those decades unwaveringly focused on Jesus and the Bible, we can only marvel that they're so generous with the little bit of time they've got. If I didn't know better, which I don't, I might think there's something spiritual going on here. But more on this later. We love you, John.
You're a good man, David.
Did Jesus rise from the dead? The short answer, yes. The long answer, yes. And having a verifiable miracle at its core is one of the most important differences between Christianity and its competitors. I find it fascinating that atheists dogmatically insist that the message of Christianity is just put your blind faith in our religion, when Christianity, more than any other worldview I'm aware of, has always said, here's how you can know that this is true. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul says to the people of Athens, tells them that God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So if Christians proclaim, here's the proof, why do atheists here just believe without any evidence whatsoever? It's as if hearing they do not hear and seeing they do not see. But for those with ears to hear, knowing that Jesus rose from the dead is actually much simpler than people realize. To know that Jesus rose from the dead, we only need to know two things. One, that he was dead, and two, that he was alive again later. If Jesus was dead and he was alive again later, I'd say that our atheist friends have a great big Son of God-shaped hole in their worldview. I doubt that John and I are going to have any disagreement on whether Jesus was dead, because we both studied the sources, and Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the best established facts of ancient history. Now, the new generation of atheists who learn about Christianity primarily from websites or social media may be surprised to hear that there are historical facts about Jesus. They think of Jesus as a mythical figure, like Hercules, except that they're much angrier about Jesus for some reason. It's a tragedy of the internet age that positions that would be laughed out of the room at the scholarly level can become quite popular at the internet level by circulating among people who don't know much about a topic. At the scholarly level, Jesus mythers are thought of as along the same lines as Holocaust deniers, but at the internet level, it seems like every other atheist I run into says Jesus never existed. Really? Well, what books have you read on this? None, but I watched like 3 YouTube videos, so I'm obviously more knowledgeable than every respected scholar on the planet. Meanwhile, even some of the most critical historical Jesus scholars will acknowledge certain facts about Jesus. That he was baptized by John the Baptist, that he had disciples, that he was known as a miracle worker and an exorcist, that he believed he played a crucial role in the coming of the kingdom of God, and of course that he died by crucifixion. The scholarly consensus on Jesus' death arises from having a variety of ancient sources. There are Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources reporting Jesus' death, and knowing how crucifixion works. Today we tend to think of crucifixion as just nailing someone to a cross, but Roman crucifixion was a 3-step process. The first step was the scourging, which was sometimes called the half-death, because victims would be half dead by the time it was finished. The Romans used a flagrum made of leather thongs with chunks of bone and metal woven into the strands, designed for removing human flesh. We have records of people being beaten until their veins and arteries were exposed, or until their bones were showing, or until their intestines spilled out. Julius Caesar remarked, "It is more grievous to be scourged than to be put to death." And that was just the beginning. Step 2 was nailing the victim to a cross and letting him hang there while blood drained out of him. Once he stopped gasping for breath, the Romans knew their work was done. Almost. The Romans didn't take crucifixion lightly, so there was a third step, a death blow, just to make sure their victim was dead. If they needed to pry someone off a cross, they would smash his head in, or stab him through the heart with a sword or a spear, or set him on fire, or let wild animals rip him apart. Not the sort of process anyone's going to walk away from. So Jesus' death isn't simply a point of Christian doctrine, it's a fact of history, as even non-Christian scholars are happy to admit. Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the infamous Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. According to Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And as everyone's favorite scholarly critic of Christianity, Bart Ehrman, maintains, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. The real question for us tonight, then, is whether Jesus was alive again. How would we know if Jesus was alive at some point following his execution by the Romans? Same way we know many other things from history. We need witnesses, and we need to know that we can trust these witnesses. Do we have witnesses of the risen Jesus? Yes, lots. Fortunately, they began preaching almost immediately, and we have summaries of some of their early sermons. They issued official creedal statements that could be easily memorized and passed on to others. They sent out representatives with authoritative traditions that would eventually be incorporated into the Gospels and other writings. We also have writings and quotations outside the New Testament from the next generation of Christian leaders, which included people like Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who knew one or more of the apostles and who continued preaching the message of the apostles, especially the resurrection of Jesus. But the most interesting source on the eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus is an early Christian creed recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. 1 Corinthians was written around AD 55, and Paul says in the letter that he had already delivered the creed to the church in Corinth, which would have been several years earlier. But Paul received the creed long before that, either when he visited the apostles in Jerusalem or perhaps even at his conversion, and scholars date its formulation to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. James D.G. Dunn writes, "This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death." According to Michael Goulder, Paul received the tradition, that is, he was taught it at his conversion perhaps 2 years after Jesus' death. Ulrich Wilkins says that the creed indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. Gerrit Ludemann maintains that the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Paul Barnett dates the creed to within 2 or 3 years of the first Easter. Richard Burridge and Graham Gould say it dates from only a few years after Jesus' death. Robert Funk in the Jesus Seminar put it within 2 or 3 years at most. Richard Hayes says it originates within about 3 years after Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, and Alexander Wedderburn asserts that it goes back to the first half of the 30s. So there's widespread agreement among scholars that from across the theological spectrum that 1 Corinthians 15 contains very early material that goes right back to the original apostles of Jesus shortly after his death. Let's read the passage. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you, the Christians of Corinth, as of first importance," this is foundational information, "what I also received." Begin creed that Paul received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. Paul is writing this years later, so he adds parenthetically, "most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." The original would have ended with the appearance to all the apostles, but Jesus appeared to Paul later, so Paul adds, "and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." Notice what we have here. We have Jesus' death for sins, his burial, his resurrection on the third day, and numerous appearances, and we have all of it as authoritative tradition within a few years, within, if not within months, of the crucifixion. As for the appearances, there are appearances to individuals, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and eventually Paul, to small groups, the 12 and all the apostles, and to a large group. He appeared to more than 500. The list also reports appearances to both friends and foes. Peter and the apostles were followers of Jesus during his 3-year ministry, but James and Paul weren't. James didn't believe that his brother was the Messiah when Jesus was preaching in Galilee and Judea, and Paul persecuted the church and tried to destroy it. Yet they're all listed as witnesses who saw Jesus alive again sometime after his death. This passage eliminates 2 skeptical responses to Jesus' resurrection, the legend hypothesis and the hallucination hypothesis. At the internet level, there are still people who claim that Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection arose through a process of legendary development over a period of many decades. But this is factually false. We know as a fact of history that the resurrection was the heart of Christian preaching from the beginning.
Very, very compelling evidence. And so I'm going to present a little bit more evidence. Stay tuned. So here is what we know. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. You can see the secular historian Josephus for further information on that. Women first discovered his empty tomb, and no one claimed Jesus was buried anyplace else until about 1700 years later. His dead body was never produced. All 4 Gospels attest to the fact that Jesus is risen. Paul, who once hunted and persecuted Christians, indicated he saw the risen Christ in 1 Corinthians 15, as just mentioned by David Wood, along with 500, including the 12. Early Christians, including Paul, Peter, Stephen, and James, were often beaten, jailed, stoned, hung on crosses, or beheaded. Examples can be found in Acts, the epistles, and in external writings by Polycarp, Pliny the Younger, and Tacitus. Christianity was not legalized until 313, when Constantine finally gave it legal protections. It started as a religion of peace. This is unlike the Muslim faith, and it grew through peaceful interactions of the apostles and disciples. By 313, Christianity had between 5 and 6 million adherents. See a secular writing by Geoffrey Wawrow, which was confirmed and co-authored by 40 global scholars in the Historical Atlas. Some assumptions that people say are, if we refute the attributions, testimonies, biographies, and histories of people in Jesus' time, we should be able to provide support for our refutations from Jesus' time. We can't discount the claims of ancient Christians merely because they're Christians. Christianity logically follows the discovery of information about Jesus' resurrection. So the fact that someone became a Christian after learning about Jesus does not discount his or her evidence. Jesus fulfilled 330 prophecies of the Old Testament. In Science Speaks, Peter Stoner analyzed the probability that any man might have fulfilled 8 prophecies to be 1 in 10 to the 17th power, or 1 in 100 quadrillion. Stoner suggests that we take the 10 to the 17th silver dollars and lay them on the face of Texas. They will cover all the state 2 feet deep. Now mark one of these silver dollars and stir the whole mass thoroughly. Blindfold a man and tell him he can travel as far as he wishes, but he must pick up that 1 marked silver dollar. What are the chances of him getting the right one? Just the same chance that the prophets would have had of writing those 8 prophecies, just 8 prophecies, and having them all come true in any one man. Here are some prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Around 1000 before Christ, King David wrote Psalm 22, which described Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus drew our attention to the verses while on the cross when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Around 700 BC, Zechariah 12:10 said, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son." Some other prophecies are including Isaiah 53, which was written around 700 years before Christ. And in Isaiah 53 includes this quote, "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Another prophecy in Daniel 9 was written around 530 years before Christ. Daniel 9 predicted Jesus' coming, death, and the destruction of the Second Temple, which occurred in 70 AD under the Romans. Know and understand this: from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, which again was recorded around 444 BC to 33 AD, until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler will come to destroy the city and the sanctuary. And again, this happened under the Roman Empire in 70 AD. The fact that the Jewish temple was destroyed in 70 AD is very interesting. Another one in Malachi 3:1, which was written around 400 years before Christ. "I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant, whom you desire, will come, says the Lord Almighty." Again, note that since the temple was destroyed in 70, the Lord had to have come prior to that, during the Second Temple period in which Malachi was referring. Who were the Jews expecting? Well, Jewish commentary on the Messiah in the 4th century said this. R. Alexandra said, "R. Joshua B. Levy pointed out a contradiction. It is written, in its time will the Messiah come. Whilst it is also written, I, the Lord, will hasten it. If they are worthy, I will hasten it. If not, he will come at the due time." R. Alexandri said, R. Joshua opposed 2 verses. It is written, "And behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven." This is referred to, of course, in Daniel 7. Whilst elsewhere it is written, "Behold, thy king will come unto thee, lowly and riding upon an ass." And this was written in Zechariah 9:9. If they are meritorious, he will come with the clouds of heaven. If not, lowly and riding upon an ass. You notice something going on here. We had 2 different reports of types of messiahs in the Old Testament. We have the one that's referred to as very humble, which was Jesus. We also have the coming in the final years of Jesus. And so that was referred to and coming in the clouds of heaven in Daniel 7. Now, please note that in Mark 16, Mark 14:62, Jesus made it quite clear that he is the one sitting at the right hand of the mighty one and coming on the clouds of heaven. And for this reason, Jesus was crucified. Did he claim to be the Messiah? Over 80 times in the Gospels, he referred to himself as the Son of Man. In fact, Mark 14:62 that I just referenced was a direct reference to Daniel 7. This is why he was crucified. Blasphemy. His reference infuriated the Pharisees. The son of a carpenter posed a huge threat to them since they had acknowledged he was working miracles and claiming to be God. He said, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." A direct reference to himself as the Lord. His apostles were doubtful, and Paul was persecuting Christians. During his ministry, his half-brothers, including James, tried to stop it. They thought he had gone mad. During his ministry, his apostles didn't understand what he meant by rebuilding the temple, his body, after it had been destroyed after 3 days. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus opened eyes to the prophecies. His crucifixion, during it, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. He and the other male apostles, save for John, went into hiding to avoid a similar death. Saul was busy persecuting Christians. He stood at the feet of St. Stephen when St. Stephen was being stoned. Virtually all historians, whether atheist, Christian, agnostic, Jewish, or the like, agree that something happened to change the mind of the apostles. They came out of hiding and began preaching for him for decades, despite heavy persecution. This treatment is documented within 150 years by Pliny the Younger, Josephus, and Tacitus. Some theories to refute the resurrection are without merit. The swoon theory, where Jesus faked his death, has no ancient evidence. It fails to explain change in the apostles. The twin theory has no ancient evidence as well. It fails to explain changes in the apostles. The buried in a mass grave has no ancient evidence. 1 Corinthians 15 is an early creed within a few years, and that refutes this. The disciples stole the body. No body fails to explain the change in the apostles. Mass hallucinations, like dreams, they're internal and they can't be shared. Plus, Jesus appeared to them in many modes where they could see, hear, touch, and be in his presence over a 40-day period. The disciples conspired. People don't risk their lives for a lie. They were uniquely positioned to know the truth. They said they saw Jesus in multiple modes with multiple others over a period of 40 days. Some might say miracles are impossible, yet we have tons of support for miracles even today, such as that with Barbara Comiskey Schneider, who heard my child get up and walk. She had MS, and Barbara Comiskey Schneider miraculously recovered from her MS. She was wheelchair bound in a bed with her lungs at very low capacity to be able to even breathe. It was determined that they were going to just let her pass away because she could no longer live a halfway decent life. And suddenly she heard the words of Jesus, "My child, get up and walk." She suddenly was able to get up and walk. She went to the church that day, her church, and when she walked down the aisle, people started cheering because they knew that the woman had been in a wheelchair. This is direct evidence for Jesus even acting today. This occurred in the early 1980s. Another very interesting piece of evidence that points to the divinity of Jesus is related to the resurrection of Israel and its language. The process of the Hebrew language revival began on October 13, 1881, as Eliezer ben Yehuda and his friends agreed to exclusively speak Hebrew in their conversations. As a result, the language, which had not been spoken as a mother tongue since the 2nd century CE, once again became the national language of Israel. Some 3,000 years earlier, when the Jewish people first arrived in Israel with Joshua, Hebrew was established as a national language and lasted for more than a millennium, until Bar Kokhba War in 135. 9 million people speak Hebrew today. Furthermore, 1,878 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, Israel is again added to the map. This is unheard of. Consider how the implications of such a thing. Where are they now? The Hittites, which were mentioned in Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, and Samuel, and Ezra, no longer here. The Amalekites, no longer here. The Jebusites, no longer here. The Amorites, no longer here. Canaanites, gone. The only ones who are back are the Israelites, God's chosen people. Thank you so much. Please like and subscribe, and do come again. I really appreciate that you're here. Bye-bye.